Hello, Namaste, and welcome to the 8th episode in the special edition of CD Baat. I'm your host Pawan, and today we're going to talk about a very, very important issue that we all must understand, and that is the importance of law and the ignorance of law in India. We often see in TV debates that people quote law and legal arguments, and some quote some other argument, and the whole thing gets blurred. Nobody understands in the end what is the importance of law, and they become ignorant. So you have a debate coming up where you have people quoting the finer points of law, and some people say it is not right. So there's an ignorance and there's an importance coming at the same time. How do we translate this ignorance into enlightenment and education about the law, and then translate it to understanding the importance of law? You only need an expert to do it, and today to do that, to give us an enlightened picture about law, constitution, and how the Indian framework is set up, we have with us today a very special guest, and that is Mr. Sankalp Desai, who is a fourth-year law student pursuing his BA LLB from OP Jindal Law School in Haryana. Welcome, Sankalp. Over to you for your opening remarks.
You mentioned a lot of TV debates, which I think in the context of CAA and the abrogation of Article 370, they had a lot of elements, legal elements, dealing with various intricacies of the constitution or the specific statute in question, or the question of presidential order in the case of abrogation of Article 370. And the problem is, when there is a lot of constitutional law involved, there is no specific correct answer to a question, because you will find many judgments, Supreme Court judgments, going either way. That was the case in the 370 issue, when the article was abrogated, or rather deoperationalized. The Supreme Court had two different conflicting judgments, one from the 60s, one from the 70s, and the Supreme Court first had to rule whether these judgments are at all in conflict. And I think this year they ruled that they are not in conflict and they have to be read together harmoniously. So this is a question of interpretation not just of statutes, but how you understand judgments, what the implications of a single judgment are. A judgment on a specific issue can, have severe implications on another field of law, or another issue in the same field of law. So when you try to condense all of these intricacies and complexities into one television debate, obviously it's going to be inaccessible to the people. So I think it's more of a fault of the system we follow in India, which is the common law system largely, where you know the plain meaning of the statutes do not matter so much, but when a court interprets it or reinterprets it and gives it a new color, that is something which is not very accessible to the people. And another issue is how long these judgments tend to be. When the Ram Janmabhoomi judgment was announced, a lot of people on social media, common people who are not, who don't deal with law on a regular basis, they remarked at how long the judgment was. And most of it was superfluous. It wasn't necessary to the issue being decided. So I think that's one of the reasons why this is a problem, because the legal education has become so inaccessible that not everybody can understand the intricacies and complexities of law, and you cannot condense them into a television debate.
Sankalp, you rightly mentioned about the way people try to condense a voluminous and a detailed judgment going into every aspect of a case into a few minutes debate where one tries to shout over the other, and then the whole issue fizzles out in the end. I'd like to know from you, what is the constitutional aspect, and what is the philosophy underlying the Indian Constitution? Is it in consonance with the Indian culture? Because people people in general have a very narrow understanding of the Constitution, that it has been copied from all the other countries, and that is why we have to go for a change in the Constitution. Do you think such arguments are coming out of a lack of understanding of the Constitution? What is your take?
There are three aspects to a constitution. One is its text, which is the written words in a constitution. The second is constitutional law, which is the interpretation of the text by the courts, and it is usually, evolving, changing over time. And then the third part is the constitutionalism part. And I think Professor Upendra Bakshi, he talks about how this is C1, C2, and C3. C1 being the text, C2 being the constitutional law, C3 being the philosophy underlying the constitution, which is called constitutionalism. And the Indian constitution, a lot of people say that it doesn't have any specific social economic philosophy underlying it. But then I don't think that's the case. A lot of people disagree. They say that there are certain core ideals which are, so intrinsic to the constitution that they cannot be changed. And uh, principles like secularism, which came into the preamble only in 1976, but a lot of people argue, and I think it's a lot of Supreme Court judgments also have held that it was implicit in the Constitution even before 1976. Then there's also the principle of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and social and economic justice. These are ideals which are underlying the Constitution. They are implicit in the fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy. They feature elsewhere. There's the principle of federalism. So depends on whether you can call these philosophies. But yes, the Constitution does have a very, deeply entrenched philosophy. Coming to the question of Indian culture, whether this the constitution, the philosophy underlying the constitution is in consonance with Indian culture, it is a very tricky question to answer, because a lot of members of the constituent assembly, they remarked that they couldn't see anything Indian about this constitution, and people like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, they disagreed. They said that this is in consonance with Indian culture. There are certain aspects to our fundamental rights and in our directive principles of state policy which deal with issues which are specifically Indian. One is Article 17, which abolishes untouchability and makes it a criminal offense. No other constitution in the world at that time ever made anything a criminal offense. Usually constitutions just deal with the structure of the government and give out a bill of rights, but this was the first time a constitution was outlawing something. There's also the question of Article 15, which operates against private entities also and prohibits them from discriminating when it comes to access to public spaces. So there is a distinct philosophy underlying it, some of it Indian, some of it not. But mostly the overarching broad theme of the Indian constitution, it does, not match with the Indian culture, because before the Britishers came, there was no constitutional culture as such. There were monarchies, and India had not seen a republic since the time of Lichavis, who were like 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And it has been a continuous history of monarchies. And then the colonial government comes in. This government doesn't recognize Indians as subjects. People, you know, Indian people were never considered to be people having rights. It was only just the Britishers who had rights in India. And then the constitution comes in, it tries to effect a social transformation, but I don't think it is that deeply connected to Indian culture as such, because these are ideals which come from the West. But then there were people in the 19th century and the 18th century who did articulate a culture of rights. There was Raja Ram Mohan Roy who spoke of dignity, and there were a lot of other people in the 19th century, early 19th century. There was Jyotirao Phule who talked about abolishing untouchability, and he spoke of, there was Savitri Bai Phule. So there was a culture of, discussion and discourse on rights, especially dealing with women, reformation of, widow remarriage, sati abolition. There were these questions, but the constitution tried to address them, but it got lost in the moment, which was, I think, largely creating a new nation, an independent nation, and also in the backdrop of partition. And they didn't want any single, religion as such to dominate the discourse within the constitution. And the Constituent Assembly tried to remain as secular as possible and as modern as possible. And I think there is a disconnect which needs to be resolved, but I'm not sure how. You can't effect a change in the constitution to do that, essentially, because it will be very problematic. And the Supreme Court has held repeatedly that the basic structure of the constitution cannot be changed. And we don't know whether the basic structure of the constitution is in consonance with Indian culture. That's a question which it requires a lot of inquiry, but in my opinion, not so much. I think there needs to be some sort of amelioration and a compromise between the constitutional values and the cultural values of India.
Sankalp, thank you for giving us such a good explanation regarding the philosophy of the Indian Constitution, what is the underlying basis and the basic structure, and you have given us a very detailed picture. Be that as it may, I'd like to first, before we move on to the next segment, I'd like to remind our viewers two things. The most of your constitutional provisions regarding the governance of a country, you have a parliament, you have a system of courts, and you have a lot of this related aspects. All of this is picked up from the Government of India Act 1935. And the second point is that the basic structure doctrine, as is popularly quoted, is the philosophy of the constitution, is that this is first recorded in two iconic judgments of the Supreme Court of India, and that is the IC Golaknath case, and the second case is the iconic, most often quoted Kesavanand Bharati versus State of Kerala case in 1973. Be that as it may, now I'd like to ask you, Sankalp, what is the ignorance of law, or why do you think people in India are generally not aware of the intricate details of law? What is the way ahead? How do you think people react when Supreme Court and legal, legal arguments are put out? What is your reading of how agitated are people in India regarding law, and why is the case?
Yes, so that is true. A lot of people, including our Chief Justice M.C. Mahajan, who was a Chief Justice in the 1950s, he believed that the Government of India Act was slavishly copied and made into the Constitution of India. And now moving on, when it comes to legal education, I think the problem is not that the people are disinterested or that they're incapable of understanding the intricacies of the law, which they're not. I mean, a lot of people have an insight, they have an instinct about how the government should be functioning, how society should be arranged, how, you know, certain rights, should be enforced, certain directive principles of state policy should be followed. Everybody has an opinion. I mean, most people who say that they're apolitical, even they, do have an instinct of a sort when it comes to arrangement of the governance of society. The thing is, lawyers tend to overcomplicate things, and in fact, like the two judgments you mentioned, IC Golaknath and Keshavananda Bharati, they are poles apart. Their effect was the same, to make certain provisions of the constitution beyond the scope of amendment, put them beyond the scope of amendment, but they did it very differently, and there are so many intricacies involved that in fact Keshavananda Bharati overruled Golaknath. The implications of these judgments were so diverse, and to explain it to a lay person, it would require a lot of patience, because not everybody has that kind of interest, passion in knowing the intricacies. They just want to know what happened. And now I think in today's time, like especially since the 90s, there has been a tendency to beautify everything, to put in ornamentation on everything. You read the judgments from the 90s, you see like it starts in the 70s, but it becomes concretized in the 90s, that whenever there is a judgment being given, the judge tries to beautify his language, writes a lot of complicated stuff. There's a lot of journalism done in the 2017 2018 about Chief Justice Deepak Mishra and his way of writing, which was very convoluted, and he used to write a lot of prose which didn't really make any sense. And a critique of the Supreme Court has been this, that the Supreme Court writes a lot of beautiful stuff, but in the end, when it comes to what it concretely does, it fails there. And there was a Supreme Court judge of the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He talked about the bad man principle in law, which is that a person, usually people who come in conflict with the law, they're not really, good or bad. They're gray. And this kind of a person, whom he called the bad man, he cares only about the consequence of the law. He wants the lawyer to tell him what the law will do to him if he violates this, or how he can avoid violating this provision, get away with, some loophole. And that is the perspective of a bad man. He just wants to know what the consequence will be, what the court will tell him, and how it will affect him personally. Now, since the 80s and late 70s, the Supreme Court has evolved the public interest litigation scheme. Now, this is just an example. Now, what the court does is it writes a lot of beautiful, it beautifully worded, crafted judgments. But what they do to, in concrete, real terms, is largely nothing. For an example, I'll tell you about the Olga Tellis case, which arose from Bombay. There were slum dwellers in Bombay who were being evicted because they were considered nuisance, and there was a Bombay Municipal Corporation Act from the 19th century which authorized such eviction, and this case went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was then, the Chief Justice was Y.V. Chandrachud, who was the father of D.Y. Chandrachud today, who is known as a liberal icon. And Y.V. Chandrachud was initially a very conservative judge. After the 70s, he he's perceived as being one of the most liberal judges. But then in Olga Tellis, what he does is essentially he creates a right to livelihood. He talks about how slum dwellers should not be evicted like this because it's a question of their livelihood. They cannot work from elsewhere. And he said that this is a question of access to jobs, access to work. And then in the end, he says that these people can be evicted under the act, and he doesn't strike down the act. He lets them get evicted, but at the same time he lays down a fundamental right to livelihood. And this judgment is very influential in other jurisdictions like South Africa and Bangladesh, where this judgment is highly cited. But essentially what it did to the litigant in front of it was nothing. It didn't help them. It laid down a broad, lofty ideal which is emulated elsewhere in the world. But to the litigants in the specific case, nothing really happened, and I think that leads to disenchantment, and a lot of people are disappointed when the court does this. And in fact, in recent times, no matter where you stand politically, the response of the court has been to lay down a lot of broad principles, lofty ideals. They discuss all of this constitutional morality and the constitution as a living document, but when it comes to doing something real, they fall short. And this is a very valid critique. It's made broadly. Everybody who watches the court very intently, they usually agree that this is what the court does, that it shies away from laying actually doing something while laying a framework for something in the future. To the present litigants, it doesn't really deliver as much as it should have, even according to its own principles. So these are intricacies of law which to a layperson will sound really outlandish. How can the Supreme Court say that this is a right and at the same time in the present case refuse to enforce it, or like just stop short of enforcing it? And this is how a lot of lawyers function in their daily lives. And it's a lot of calculated manipulation of language, of situations. And you have to understand the Supreme Court is as political a body as the Parliament. We try to pretend that the Supreme Court is beyond politics, but that is not the case. And usually, to hide this fact, they use a lot of heavy language to hide the fact that essentially what they're laying down is a political policy, not just the law. And in fact, if it's just the law, it does have a lot of impact on what the policy is going to be. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people need to focus more on what the Supreme Court is doing essentially. Because when it comes to fields like environmental law, the Supreme Court is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. There are some fields where the Supreme Court takes over and just goes ahead with it, and the legislature just waits and watch for the Supreme Court to do something. And the PIL aspect, the public interest litigation aspect, this is where the Supreme Court has essentially taken over all the functions of all the branches of the government. And there are instances in the 2000s when the Delhi High Court undertook a slum demolition drive where they laid down the law, they laid down executive orders, they decided the law, and they went ahead with this. So the Supreme Court and the High Courts, they play a lot of they play a very important role in India's polity. And as such, anybody who tries to understand Indian politics without understanding what the Supreme Court is doing or the High Courts are doing is essentially being blind to a very important branch of our government. And I think there needs to be a lot of legal education and some realism to be incorporated into our education of law, or just generally even when in school, when we focus on subjects like science and maths, we also need to focus on our society, our polity, our history, modern history. And the Supreme Court and the High Courts play a very important role there. And I think we need to start teaching, since the school level, children about how the world that they're going to be a part of functions.
Sankalp, many people will agree with me when I say you have hit the nail on the head when you say that Supreme Court is becoming as political a body as the government of the day, in many cases. So I'd like to ask you on before we move on to the other topic, the other segment. I'd like to inform our viewers that Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, who is the father of the present Supreme Court Judge, Justice Dhananjay Chandrachud, has been the longest serving Chief Justice of India from 1978 to 1985. The issue of PILs or the public interest litigation has come about thanks to a very erudite and well informed judge called V.R. Krishna Iyer of the Supreme Court. Public interest litigations are what you have as a tool as citizens to file a case in Supreme Court or in any court, directing the Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court to direct the government or the concerned authority to resolve a case in the public interest. The case has to be in public interest, and that's how you have a lot of PILs coming up these days in the Supreme Court and the High Courts. Moving on, Sankalp, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned the case of how legal legislation has to come about and all of it. What do you think? Do you think regarding the CAA protest that happened overall, where you have had lawyers quoting and you have people for and against without actually knowing the text of the law? The text of the law had been very clear by enunciating that there is a certain group which has to be given the citizenship. There's a certain criteria for it. There's a lot of details that the law goes into. The text of the amendment goes into. Yet we saw such big outrage, and we have problems across the board saying this is unconstitutional, and every media outlet comes with its own agenda and says that there are certain aspects and that is why it is unconstitutional. Nobody gives the citizens a full idea, or nobody even spares a thought for spares even a certain amount of time to understand what is the law, what is the history, what is the rationale. There's a lot of everything gets mixed up with politics, and the legal issue is blown out of proportions, and the legal issue is actually separated from the political, is not separated, rather they are mixed. So there's no understanding to the layman. What do you think is the way forward? Do you think helping textbooks, change textbooks, where you have a mention of the law, you have a certain case and everything is, do you think that's the way forward, or do you think people are talking these days a lot on the fundamental rights and how it is important, right to equality, right to free speech, right to liberty, Article 14, 21, all of these are quoted. But nobody talks about the fundamental duties, which is as important as fundamental rights. So what do you think is the issue behind this? How do you think this can be resolved? Do you think it is being resolved by way of new ways of learning? We have YouTube, we have people putting up their own explanations. Do you think that is helping a lot? And do you think that is as effective as what you have in school time, where you have a textbook and civics talking about fundamental rights, all of this?
So I'll answer your question in three parts. First, I'll deal with the CA and Article 14. So the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 essentially did this, that it identified a few religious groups who were minorities in our neighboring countries, which are dominated by a Muslim population, who were persecuted on religious grounds, and it provides them a fast track path towards citizenship. Now, what this law does is it just provides them with citizenship. These people who are coming in from other countries who need, who are being persecuted in those three countries. It doesn't deal with refugees. It doesn't say that Muslim refugees will be turned back, or only Hindu and Christian and the religions mentioned in that list, where the refugees from these religions will be accepted. It doesn't deal with refugees at all. All it does deal with is citizenship for these people. And the rationale given is that because Islam is the dominant religion in these three countries, refugees coming in from these three countries who belong to the religion of Islam will not be given, citizenship on a fast track basis, because it's not really needed by them. and also a rationale given was that since there are a lot of other countries in the world which recognize Islam as their official state religion, that these people don't really need as such citizenship in India. It's not an urgent necessity. It doesn't deal with the status as refugees. It doesn't talk about how they'll be kicked out of the country. It doesn't say that at all. It just says that these religious groups will be given preference when it comes to citizenship. Now, the constitution, when it comes to the question of citizenship, like in current times, the only article relevant is Article 11, which leaves it up to the parliament to make any provisions whatsoever when it comes to citizenship. And other courts in the world, especially the US Supreme Court, they've taken the position that when it comes to citizenship as a question, it falls in this space called the sovereign legal space, where the government is supreme and any decision taken in that space will be, when it comes to judicial review, the court's inquiry will be very limited. And in India, the fundamental rights, the chapter of fundamental rights, has a lot of provisions, but very few deal with people who are not citizens. Article 15, which deals with prohibition on the grounds of religion, it applies only to citizens. Prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of religion, it applies only to citizens. And the only article which applies here in this context would be Article 14, or by an extension Article 21, but I'll not deal with that here. I'll just talk about Article 14. Now, Article 14 guarantees equality before law and equal protection of the laws to, any person. Now, it sounds very straightforward, but the meaning is not that clear. When you say equality before the law, what does it really mean? When you say equal protection of the laws, what does that mean? Now, our Supreme Court in the 50s, it interpreted this article to mean that it does not really prohibit classification as such. It prohibits class legislation, it prohibits hostile discrimination, but it doesn't prevent classification. A reasonable classification. A reasonable classification has to be a classification which, is based on intelligible differentia, which means that the differentiation being made is intelligible, is clear, and then there's a rational nexus to the purpose of the legislation, that the differentiation, the classification you are making has some connection to the purpose of the legislation, which is making the classification in the first place. So this is a very straightforward test. This is one of the many tests applicable under Article 14. And this was discussed a lot of times in the context of the CAA on television debates during protests. And a lot of people said that the CAA does not, satisfy this test because it's hostile discrimination. It's not just, a reasonable classification. And another argument given was that religion cannot be the basis of classification under Article 14. But that's simply not the case, because you have a lot of personal laws applicable to citizens, despite Article 15, that these laws are valid, that personal laws which, classify on the basis of religion. And a lot of high court judgments from the 50s, they've recognized that, religions can be considered as members of a religious group can be considered a class in themselves. And, a law can be made which is differentiating between two religions, like the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Succession Act. It applies only to Hindus, it doesn't apply to Muslims, it doesn't apply to Christians. There are special enactments for these religions as well. So if you say that these enactments are valid, then it means that religion can be a basis for classification under Article 14. And keep in mind that Article 15 does not even apply to citizens. Article 15 is the article which talks about discrimination on the ground of religion, which is prohibited. But Article 14 does not say anything as such about religion. So it's all, how you perceive things. It's your political ideology which plays a lot of, very important role in how you understand the CAA debate. So I think the reason why a lot of people got so worked up about this is because there is certainly a lack of nuance from both the sides, not just the people who protested against the law, but people who went in, spoke in favor. Most arguments which were being made were not legal as such. And when you're dealing with a law which you claim is unconstitutional, you cannot make political arguments really, because the Supreme Court will not really accept them, especially when it's such a visible issue and it's a case which is so, going to be in the public eye. The Supreme Court will try not to be very political in this, so they'll try to keep it as formal, as legal as possible. And the legal arguments can lead you to two different conclusions as always, but that doesn't mean that this act is so blatantly unconstitutional that you need to come out and protest. And I do understand the sentiment behind it, because it identifies and confers some benefits on certain religions, it doesn't do that with other religions as such. But then there's a clear rationale given. So I think there needs to be a very nuanced debate about this, which can come about only when it comes to legal education, like true legal education. And I think a lot of YouTube videos and television interviews were given where Supreme Court advocates, like one of them was Desai Deepak, who gave a very nuanced analysis of this issue. There were people like Suhrit Parthasarthi from people who were against the CA, and senior advocates like Harish Salve who were in favor of it, giving television interviews. But then this becomes a nuance is lacking from all these debates. They speak of lofty concepts which are not really accessible to people, who don't deal with the law on a regular basis, who do not have a lot of legal background. It seems esoteric and inaccessible to them. So I think there is a need to educate people first about certain constitutional values, or these the interpretation of these fundamental rights, because even if you are going to make a very nuanced video, it will be lacking in some way or the other. And this debate about the CA, it can be as narrow as you want it. Like the legal debate, the legal aspect of it, it can be as narrow as you want it to be. It can be as broad as you want it to be. You can make it about a broad question of secularism. You can make it a narrow question about reasonable classification, which is not really dealing with secularism as much. But essentially it boils down to what your political ideology is, and this is a question which cannot be resolved by the Supreme Court as such. And I think the trend of the Supreme Court, the Indian Supreme Court, and the high courts when it comes to citizenship has been very conservative, like the US Supreme Court. There are Madras High Court judgments which say that fundamental rights do not apply in this context, in the context of citizenship. Most of them. There was the judgment of the Supreme Court called the Sarbanand Sonowal case. It dealt with illegal immigration, and the Supreme Court held that illegal immigration amounts to external aggression, and that the government of India has a duty to prevent this external aggression and make sure that illegal immigrants don't come in. And because it's the sovereign space, the Supreme Court is very reluctant to rigorously apply fundamental rights against not against such legislations which deal with citizenship as such, because this is traditionally under legal thought is considered to be the sovereign space where the state has absolute authority to decide on these questions. Another sometimes usually is the law of taxation, where the Supreme Court is very reluctant to interfere. The interpretation given to tax legislations is very narrow, and the Supreme Court is very cautious when it comes to questions like these. And I think, regardless of what the Supreme Court decides, this is a question which will be decided in the public arena also. Like the Supreme Court can just add to it, I think, in my opinion. But the public discourse needs to be very, informed, well informed, and for that we need a lot of nuanced legal education, which cannot be just provided by a few YouTube videos. They do help, I'm not saying that they don't help, but there needs to be a broader aspiration towards legal education generally. And coming to your question about fundamental duties and fundamental rights of course are enforceable. They can be you know there is a specific article in the constitution, which article 13, which says that any law which is in contravention of fundamental rights will be void. But fundamental duties as such impose duties on citizens. Fundamental rights are protecting individuals from oppression of the state. Now you need to understand that there is a power dynamic at play here. There is a state which is one of the most powerful, this is the most powerful entity in your country, in any nation, that the state is the most powerful. And when it acts against to the detriment of these fundamental rights, obviously the question becomes very important, because if you let the state violate certain rights, it will become very dangerous. And this is coming from a very liberty oriented ideology of the 18th century, which animates the US Constitution as well, the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution. That when the state acts against an individual, preference is always given to the individual. Usually the benefit of doubt is given to the individual in this case, because the state is a very powerful entity, and when it's acting against individual, the courts are usually much more rigorous in their analysis. And I think that's the reason why the fundamental rights are, in my opinion, more important than fundamental duties as such, because duties deal with citizens being helping the helping the integrity of the nation, helping preserve the integrity of the nation and everything, which is very important, no doubt. But I don't think you can elevate them over fundamental rights. Also, speaking legally, the fundamental rights, no other part of the constitution, such as say directive principles of policy, state policy, and fundamental duties, they cannot be elevated over the fundamental rights, because that would violate the basic structure as laid down in Minerva Mills, that the directive principles and the fundamental rights are two wheels of the same chariot, and you cannot put one over the other, because then the chariot would, you know, turn over and fall. So I think the fundamental rights, in my opinion, they matter a lot, because there's a question of power equations here, which do not really come up when it comes to duties, because it's the individual's duty towards other individuals and towards the state. And when it comes to fundamental rights, is the state acting against an individual? And like you mentioned, Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, who brought in the public interest litigation uh, as a remedy in India, he once said that no matter how evil or pariah a citizen of India is, he has the same dignity as the others, and his dignity cannot be subservient to other people's dignity or the state's interests, and you have to analyze it very carefully, because even if it's a person who's weak, who is not a good citizen of India, who's not performing his duties well, even if his rights are at question, the court should step in, because that just means that you are letting the letting the state impinge on the fundamental rights of everybody else by letting it impinge on somebody who is not technically following their duties, and you are letting his rights being waived off, which just opens a lot of doors for tyranny to enter. And I think that's the reason why rights matter more than duties, at least in our constitutional framework. But generally speaking, I think in Hindu jurisprudence, like ancient Hindu jurisprudence, the question was always about duties over rights. And every right essentially is somebody else's duty, isn't it? Like, I have a right to something, which means that somebody has a duty to uphold that right towards me. It's all reciprocal. If I perform my duties, I'm essentially fulfilling somebody else's rights. I have a duty towards somebody, which means they have a right towards my duty. And it's a very reciprocal kind of a relation between a right and a duty, which needs to be understood. And I think the Chief Justice of India, who's Justice Bobde, he recently articulated the same value in a television interview, if I'm not wrong. And he essentially said that duties and rights are corollaries. But I think if you look at it ultimately, in my opinion, at least in today's context of technology and surveillance and everything, I think you should give a preference to individual rights over individual duties, because the state is a very powerful mechanism. You never really know who is calling the shots, and in such a situation, I think individual rights do matter. But when the discourse boils down to this is my right, this is my right, I have a right to that, I have a right to this, you also need to understand that apart from the fact that you have duties also which you are ignoring, you also have certain limitations on your own rights, that your rights are not absolute and unfettered. Everybody has rights, but that doesn't mean they're absolute. There are certain restrictions which can be imposed on your rights, and you need to be aware of when to not exercise your rights yourself, and even if you're exercising them, you need to know that the state can sometimes stop you from doing that, and can do it validly. It's not like the fundamental rights are absolute and unfettered. So I think this is also a very important thing which people need to know, that your rights are not absolute. That there are certain things you absolutely cannot do. Like when it comes to free speech, there are reasonable restrictions under Article 19.2 which can be imposed. One of them is the safety and security of the state, or contempt of court. You cannot just say things blindly and get away with it. It's not an absolute right as such, free speech. And when it comes to Article 21, which talks about life and liberty, and like recently in 2017 the Supreme Court said that privacy is a part of Article 21, but that doesn't mean that privacy is an absolute right. It can be taken away. It can be taken away by laws which are proportional, which follow the due process of law. So rights aren't exactly absolute, and people need to realize that as well. And I think when once you realize that, you'll also start thinking about your duties as well. So it has to be construed in harmony. You cannot put duties over rights or rights over duties, or restrictions over your rights themselves, because that would render your rights meaningless. So I think there needs to be a harmonious construction of all these various parts of the constitution, and nothing should be given a primacy over the other.
Sankalp, first of all, thank you for giving us such a detailed explanation, and also it's a wonderful explanation because it's very lucid. Nobody could have done it better than you, and you have done full justice to today's topic. I'm sure many of our viewers will agree at this juncture. I'd like to stress on one important point, which is a big takeaway from this episode, and that is you must not only understand what is your duty and your right, but also what is the rule of law. You must also understand the knowledge of law. You must also have a knowledge of law. Knowledge of law is very empowering, and will not only empower you but also people around you. When you disseminate information of law and all the legal aspects, which is what Sankalp did today, you will also feel empowered. The same way he has educated all of us on today's issues. Before we wind up today, I'd like to remind you all that Sankalp has a blog called aboutthelawthree60.wordpress.com. Do check it out and leave some feedback, because it's a very good initiative that Sankalp has taken to let others know let even common people know what all law has and how complex it is. And on that note, I hope you all liked today's episode. Do subscribe to our channel, and this is your host Pawan Kumar signing off. Thank you.